Thank you very much. I want to talk about Yemen more in terms of the destruction of cultural heritage in Yemen is more driven by the conflict at the moment than by the sort of ideological problems posed by Al-Qa'ida and ISIS. But both are active there and both have this ambition, and the way that the conflict is going is allowing them opportunity to expand. But I thought I'd just, before I started that, I wanted to just make some brief points really to follow up what Ali has said. Really that both Al-Qaeda and ISIS are organisations and well organised groups, and one has to recognise that. They may have this ideology, but it's actually, they have a means of affecting it. In the case of Al-Qaeda, it's I think sees itself as a network more than a state, but it is well organised within that, with its Emir, Shura Council, operational divisions, operating through a devolved network, decentralised, spreading into different parts of the Islamic world. And I looked at Al-Qaeda just after 9/11 and looking at some of the information that was coming out about it, and what came across to me was actually it was not only well organised, but it's actually very good at motivating people. Many of the people who joined it weren't religious, but it was able to motivate them. That failure in Al-Qaeda operations is entirely acceptable. This is for young people coming into the organisations. You're faulted for not trying, not for failing. Critical thinking. The influence of a man called Abu Musab al-Suri, who was the sort of person that really looked at, say, before 9/11, the technology to sort of prevent terrorism, and worked out that low-tech could beat high-tech. And so it's that type of critical thinking you find in these organisations. It aspires for an Islamic emirate, but aspires, but doesn't seek to set it out, and a focus on the far enemy, which means the United States, as again Ali referred to. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is the Yemeni version of this. I'll speak a bit more about it in a moment. But it's interesting in that it still aspires to have a global strategy. It has attacked, organised attacks against aircraft from leaving Yemen. And the internet jihad, the internet use of the internet to recruit people really began in Yemen with a man called Noel Brehony. And he's inspired a number of terrorist operations, terrorist plots in the West. It did try to set up Islamic Emirates in 2011, 2012, but these failed because it couldn't quite make up its mind whether it was pursuing a religious agenda or, like as I'll come to with ISIS, trying also to establish a proper state. ISIS, on the other hand, seems to be a state, not a wet network. The leadership, as again Ali has described, came through Al-Qaeda. And Baghdadi himself, the leader, went through the US custody system. And this has given him a certain aura, which adds to his leadership. And they understand the need for organisation. They've brought in these alliances they form with former Baathists and others in Iraq, has brought in skilled managers to run their organisation. They understand the need to build alliances, to focus on a common enemy, Shia-dominated Iraq, Assad in Syria. They acquired resources for the regime through the control of oil and other methods, so they have money, they have resources. They aspire to deliver government in the areas in which they control, not necessarily very effective, but they set out to do so. And their propaganda is skilled. And they're now beginning to build affiliates, as we're seeing in particularly the one struck me in Sinai, where there's been a continuous partly jihadi-inspired rebellion for a number of years, but which has now declared its loyalty to ISIS. It doesn't mean ISIS has moved in, it is simply mean the organisation there has declared loyalty to the ISIS leader. And the destruction of cultural heritage is a political decision as much as an ideological decision. They have an aim in doing this, which is to intimidate people, to show their followers what they're capable of. And just also, before I want to move on to Yemen, I think this was something else that struck me that was worth raising. the way that Saudi Arabia dealt with Al-Qaeda in the 2000s. Now, no, Saudi Arabia is accused of exporting Wahhabism and being responsible for this, but it itself regards Al-Qaeda and ISIS as a deviations from Islam. And it kept talking in these terms. The Minister of Interior kept referring to Al-Qaeda theology as deviancy. They set out to eliminate the cells in Saudi Arabia, but they also involved the ulama, the religious scholars, both the traditional Wahhabi ones and the more reformist ones, in a collective effort to use the mosques, to use the internet, to use the schools, the tribes, to get over the message that there is, you know, that Al-Qaeda was a deviant form of Islamism. They reached out to Al-Qaeda sympathizers by trying to persuade schools and universities and tribes to help identify people who are vulnerable and bring them into a system which would sought to change them. There was a similar program in Egypt in the 1990s, but with perhaps more emphasis on violence. But I put that as an example to show that these ideologies can be rejected and are rejected by regimes not immediately effective, and I think that is certainly a hope for the future. And the result of all this was that by the late 2000s, Al-Qaeda was virtually eliminated from Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, it went to Yemen. When talking about Yemen, I wanted just to leave that there for a minute, just to emphasize the problems that were in Yemen before the current situation began. It basically, when all the indices of human development, Yemen tended to come at the bottom, and things like good government and anti-corruption, it came top of these indices. Does this work? Oops, sorry. Oh. Now, where are we? That's... Which one goes back? That one? That one. Oh, here we are. Yes, this is it. Right. I should keep my hand off that one. Yemen. Yemen is roughly 30% of Yemenis are Zaydi Shia. Now, the Zaydi Shia are a different form of Shia from those in Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's one that's generally regarded as being much closer to the main school of Sunni Islam, which is in Yemen, the Shafi'i school. And for the last 900 years, there's been a tradition in Yemen of living together. There have been very few problems. The Zaydi Shia area is largely, I don't think this is working, but it's the area roughly from the Mar here up to the Saudi border at Sada. It's where they're concentrated. And for centuries, Yemeni regimes tended to be based in this area. Partly because the main tribal confederations, the most organised and best equipped tribal confederations were in this area. But although the regimes were Zaydi Shia and based in these areas and attempted to control other parts of Yemen, which were largely Sunni over the centuries, the way it operated through the imams was that people were co-opted rather than confronted, and there was very little problems between the communities. The domination of the northwest was more for economic and political reasons. This area here was South Yemen, there's the east, under the British, and it became a Marxist regime in from the 1970s until it united with Yemen in 1990. The problems in Yemen really come down to the way that President Saleh, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who came to power in 1978, has created the country. His regime is not dissimilar to those in many other Arab countries, but he sought to co-opt local leaders, tribal leaders in a patronage system, that involved most people, most local leaders, most local groups, that marginalised those that were against him, under a political party they called the GPC. But within this system, he also attempted to divide and rule, to keep people off balance, to keep himself in power. In the period from 1970s to 1990s, the main threat came from Marxism, from the Yemeni Socialist Party, the ruling party in the south, which also became a significant party in the north after unity. But part of this led to the encouragement of the arrival of political Islam from that period. Initially from the Muslim Brotherhood, which came in from teachers and others expelled from Egypt and Syria at the time, but also increasing number of Salafis, often educated in Saudi Arabia. But Salafism has spread in Yemen. But for most of this period, it was the more peaceful Salafism, the non-involving Salafism. The more militant part of it came later. And this group, this Islamic part of the system, actually became part of the more patronage network, which had its own political party called Islah. In effect, the two groups shared the spoils of the system. During the 1990s, returning Afghans brought in the more violent form of Islam, and Al-Qa'ida became very well established in Yemen in the 1990s. Salafi institutes were being set up. Salafis from many parts of the world were brought into Yemen, and it became a problem area until 9/11. When the president was offered the choice of being either with George Bush in the war against terrorism or against him. And he chose to be with him. But also part of the reaction to this growth of violent jihadism was to encourage the emergence of a Zaydi Shia revival in the northwest. It became convenient as a convenient balance against Islam and a means of keeping the people, the regime's enemies, divided. But an overreaction of the regime to this Shia revival movement, initially known as the Believing Youth, but now known as the Houthis, and I'll say more about them, who they are in a minute, led to 6 rounds of fighting, 6 wars during the 2000s between the regime and Islam and the Houthis. And the way that war was run was the army units linked to Islam and Salafi militias were in the forefront of the fighting. Again, divide and rule. The regime system broke down after 2005 as oil revenues dropped, and the groups within the regime really had to fight to share spoils rather than sharing them out as they did before. And the Arab Spring arrived at a height of this problems in 2011, and from the very beginning, Islah, the political party, worked with the people in the street to against President Saleh, and the Houthis were also involved in this, but slightly separately. It came virtually to a civil war in June, in the autumn of 2011, which led to the GCC intervention and a political transition, which led to the election of President Hadi under an agreed system, with President Saleh resigning, and a coalition government formed of Islah and the GPC. A national dialogue to follow, which was to bring out a new constitution, electoral process, and sort out many Yemenis problems. The armed forces were to be restructured, and there was large economic aid to be given. But there were serious flaws in this, and that President Saleh was allowed to remain in Yemen, not only remain in Yemen, but as head of the main political party. The Houthis were not part of that coalition government. and the military restructuring simply failed in implementation. So we have a situation today where you're seeing the elite military units still loyal to President Saleh and working with the Houthis against their enemies. Now the Houthis really, so a revivalist movement beginning in the 1990s, but there were earlier origins to this, partly inspired by the Iranian Revolution, but also inspired by the intrusion of Salafism into their own area, because the way that the closeness of the two communities, many of the Zaydis in that part of Yemen went to study in Saudi Arabia, for example. So it was given expression in the Believing Youth in the 1990s. And the Houthi family, which are really traditional judges, which in a part of Yemen where the tribal configurations enable them to marry into the tribes in that area and establish themselves. And their great skill has been, although they're often seen as a militia, but one of their great skills has been to mobilize and form alliances with tribes around them. They acquired weapons and experience during their fighting of the 2000s. They're marginalized by the political transition. And more recently, they've created a political organization called Ansar-Allah, the Partisans of God, with a populist political program, anti-corruption, economic reform, attempting to draw in support. They share with Al-Qa'ida and ISIS a very strongly anti-American rhetoric, but I think throughout the last 3 or 4 years they really wanted power without responsibility. They wanted to operate behind the scenes. But during 2014-15, they've expanded their influence in neighbouring areas through militias and tribal alliances, targeting Islam and associated military forces. In 2014, they moved south, overcoming the tribal resistance in Salah, and took over Sana'a in 2014. And instead of stopping there, where they might have had the opportunity, they began to move into Sunni-majority provinces in Yemen, where resistance to them started to increase. Although President Hadi remained in office after September, the way that the Houthis tried to force him to do things that they wanted led him to resign in 2015. And then the Houthis announced their control of Yemen in February. President Hadi escaped, withdrew his resignation, and called for the coalition to intervene. This shows this map shows the expansion of the Houthis in this period, beginning right at the very top at the beginning of the year, and then that's how they moved. And their great mistake was to take the pink area in South Yemen in late 2014, early 2015, which has provoked the current war. The war has left at least 5,500 dead, tens of thousands wounded, millions displaced, great damage to infrastructure. I know we focus on the cultural heritage, but if you look at places like Sana'a, it isn't just the old city destroyed, it's factories, housing. If they're located near a military base or one side or the other's firing on the other, then the response is usually destroy the building from which they're being fired at, and there's been a lot of that. The Houthis, despite during the last 7 months, there's been a lot of fighting. The Houthis still remain in control of Sana'a and much of the north. There are major battles going on currently in Taiz, and I mean battles between different factions in the city. And more limited fighting elsewhere. And the dangers really are now that there's the power vacuum rising in many areas in the south and east of the country, where local groups are being empowered of different sorts. And the fighting didn't start off as sectarian; it is becoming sectarian in places, and this is the real danger. And AQAP and ISIS are exploiting it. Now, Al-Qa'ida in Yemen. It was reformed in 2006 when, after a jailbreak, when a lot of them got out. But from the beginning, it's always had good links to specific tribes. So it has a tribal basis. It was reorganized after 2006 and then merged with the Saudi Al-Qa'ida when it was really driven out of Saudi Arabia in 2009. And as I said earlier, they still pursue this global strategy. It is very much something that Al-Qa'ida in Yemen wants to retain. And so it created in 2011 a group called Ansar al-Sharia, the partisans of the Sharia. It's really an insurgency group which they involved local tribes to which they had link, or to which there was previous jihadi Salafi links. Some were also paid. And they created these Islamic emirates in 2 parts of Yemen for about 9 months. And they attempted at that time to impose their Islamic agenda on those towns, but unlike, say, ISIS elsewhere, they were unable to deliver the sort of services to the people. They weren't able to provide government in that area, so that there was a problem there. They had difficulty in maintaining their ability, and this has been a problem, I think, with AQAP. It doesn't quite know what it wanted. It didn't quite know there what it wanted. The leadership didn't actually. The leadership sent messages to them saying, really, do really what ISIS is doing, and don't emphasise the Islamic, the religious agenda at the moment. Focus on the political. And we're seeing in 2014 and currently now. Al-Qa'ida is exploiting the situation to join Sunni groups, Sunni tribal groups in parts of Yemen to fight against the coalition, or fight against the opposition forces, presenting themselves as defenders of Sunni Islam. In Hadramaut and Muqalla, which is one of the main port cities, Al-Qa'ida had become part of a local administration. They entered the city late last year, took over the governor's office for a while, robbed the local banks, acquiring money, but realised they weren't strong enough to be able to maintain their control, and entered into an agreement with tribal groups and local groups to run the place, to provide this administration, if you like. But again, you want to see the problems there, that they have tried to, whilst they may have been part of this administration, occasionally they break out and try and impose their religious agenda. They've destroyed Sufi shrines in the region, and they occasionally attempt in areas to impose their version of Islamic law. Al-Qa'ida is now moving into Aden and other parts of the south, despite losing a lot of people in drone attacks, and they're probably stronger now in 2011 or 2006. AKP, I think, part of the agenda is clearly it will lead to the destruction of cultural heritage, as we're seeing in Muqalla and 1 or 2 other places. But I always have the impression with AKP that it's whatever tactic works this week.